Welcome back to Luminous Star Fables.
Let's take a deep dive as I explain a powerful intersection of psychology, cultural history, trauma recovery, and personal transformation. We begin with a concept that has quietly shaped literature, mental health conversations, and social narratives: perpetual childhood. Across Google Trends, the phrase perpetual childhood appears as a niche but meaningful search term, one that spikes whenever society revisits questions about innocence, emotional development, trauma, or the treatment of disabled adults. Search patterns reveal four major themes. The literary ideal of eternal innocence. Interest rises during academic cycles and cultural nostalgia. People search for ideas like the cult of childhood, romantic innocence, and the longing to return to a simpler emotional state. The psychological archetype, the puer aeternus. Searches for man-child psychology, fear of adulthood, and puer aeternus young reflect a growing curiosity about adults who feel stuck in adolescent emotional patterns. Disability stereotypes and infantilization. Searches increase during advocacy events, especially around terms like infantilization of disabled adults and ableism examples. This highlights a cultural reckoning with how society often treats disabled adults as children. Trauma and the long shadow of childhood experiences. Terms like ACES, childhood trauma effects, and trauma brain changes show steady, year-round interest. This reflects a collective desire to understand how early wounds shape adult identity. Together, these trends reveal that while the phrase perpetual childhood is not widely searched, the ideas behind it are deeply relevant, especially for those healing from dysfunctional family systems. Now we transition into the heart of today's narrative, your workshop on recovering from narcissistic abuse and dysfunctional family dynamics. This journey is not about erasing the past. It is about understanding its architecture and reclaiming your right to author your own future. We begin by examining the narcissistic family system, redefining the empath. What society calls an empath often begins as childhood hypervigilance, a survival strategy shaped by unpredictable caregivers. This creates the empathic paradox. You become fluent in others' emotions yet disconnected from your own. I'm going to explain typical dysfunction versus narcissistic systems. Unlike general dysfunction, a narcissistic family system revolves around protecting the leader's fragile self-image. Healing as a group is nearly impossible. Adult children of narcissistic family structures sometimes embrace different values, principles, and standards that he or she did not necessarily have during their childhood. This is why many adult children eventually choose distance or no contact. Now let's take a closer look at family roles. The system assigns predictable roles. The scapegoat, often the most authentic child, targeted because they threaten the narcissist's false image. Enablers, those who passively support the dysfunction. Flying monkeys, those who actively enforce it. Seeing this structure clearly is the first step toward liberation. What I know is from personal experience that part of doing shadow work is uncovering the roots. Dysfunction rarely begins with one generation. Intergenerational trauma. Pain is passed down until someone becomes conscious enough to break the cycle. Why the scapegoat is chosen. The scapegoat is a safe victim, a mirror the narcissistic parent cannot tolerate, a threat to the family's false legacy. When survivors choose to take off the rose-colored glasses, what can happen is that he or she gains clarity about how grooming techniques or in character perhaps were applied during the relationship as a means to control. The narcissistic parent shapes each child's role, often programming the scapegoat to believe they are flawed, unlovable, or unstable. Recognizing this is painful yet profoundly empowering. What I've found to be the case with many survivors is the turning point tends to be a choice to apply no contact, usually as a last resort. The decision to go no contact is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of self-preservation. Empathic burnout. A lifetime of self-abandonment leads to a breaking point, a moment when the authentic self demands to emerge. Why no contact becomes necessary. Group healing is impossible. Your growth threatens the narcissist. The system functions like a psychological cult. Societal misunderstanding. Many people, especially older generations, cannot comprehend choosing mental health over family obligation. But the modern paradigm is shifting towards self-protection and emotional truth. So how does one begin to navigate the aftermath? No contact is not the end of pain. It is the beginning of a new kind of healing. The emotional landscape. You may experience survivor's guilt, grief for the family you wished you had, anxiety and depression, identity grief, mourning the self you had to be to survive. The perception gap. Adult children cite abuse, betrayal, and emotional disconnection. Parents often blame outside influences or label the child as difficult. This disconnect makes reconciliation nearly impossible. Now we move from understanding to rebuilding. Sacred selfishness. This is the ethical obligation to become yourself. It includes emotional sovereignty, boundary consciousness, accepting your needs as legitimate, shadow integration and reparenting. Your shadow contains the healthy traits you were punished for. Your anger, your boundaries, your no. Reparenting teaches you to give yourself the care you never received. Conscious empathy and relational selectivity. Your sensitivity becomes a choice, not a compulsion. You learn to give empathy only where it is safe and reciprocated. The safety test. After spending time with someone, ask your body, do I feel more like myself or less? Safe people adjust. Unsafe people punish. Closing reflection. The empath is, as Jung wrote, the child who was never allowed to be selfish. But this is not a flaw. It is an unfinished development. Your journey is about completing that development, about becoming whole, conscious, and sovereign. You are not returning to perpetual childhood. You are stepping into perpetual adulthood, a life defined not by survival, but by choice. If you found this content to be valuable, give it a like, share, and select the next video.
You know, when an adult child just cuts all ties with their family, it's almost always seen as this shocking, maybe even cruel thing to do. But here's a thought. What if it's not an attack at all? What if it's the final, desperate move in a lifelong fight just to preserve who you are? Today, we're going to dig into that painful journey that leads to no contact, a decision that's not born from malice, but from a deep, fundamental need to survive. Does that hit home for you? For so many people, childhood wasn't about learning to play. It was about learning to predict. This is what the famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung talked about. You basically develop these psychological antennae. You become a human seismograph for danger, totally tuned in to every little emotional tremor in your home. And this isn't just a quirky skill, it's a survival adaptation. Your brain literally rewires itself just to navigate a totally unpredictable world. All right, so let's dive into that a little deeper, this survival adaptation. We're gonna focus on a really specific and often painful role, the family scapegoat. This is the person who's basically handed the job of managing the family's emotional temperature, and it almost always comes at a huge personal cost. And this is where we run into something called the empathetic paradox. Think about it. Your incredible ability to sense what everyone else feels and needs, that very skill that kept you safe, it comes with a terrible price. You become an expert in everybody else's inner world, but you're a complete stranger to your own. Your hypersensitivity, the very thing that protected you, is now the wall that keeps you from knowing who you even are. And this, right here, gets to the absolute core of the problem. Jung had this term, authentic selfishness. And I know it sounds bad, but he meant it in a really healthy way. It's that natural drive a kid has to develop their own identity. But the child who becomes the scapegoat, they learn the exact opposite lesson. Your needs are dangerous. You have to love others more than yourself. So the self gets suppressed, making it almost impossible to set boundaries or even ask for what you need later in life. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. Let's look at how this individual experience gets shaped by the family system itself, especially when you're in an environment of control, which is often driven by a parent with narcissistic traits. In a family system like this, the parent's carefully constructed self-image, well, it's everything. It has to be protected no matter what. So any challenge to that perfect image, any sign of harmony, or an adult child's growing independence is seen as a direct threat. At the end of the day, their loyalty isn't to their child, it's to the illusion they've created for themselves. So, you might be wondering, how do they maintain this control? Well, one of the most common and devastating tactics is something called character. It's this subtle, sneaky process where the parent will actually set up situations to make the scapegoat look like the bad guy. You know, they'll poke and prod you in front of guests until you finally react, and then it's like, see, they're the difficult one. They'll even get other family members to gang up on you, isolating you, and convincing everyone, maybe even you, that you're the real source of all the problems. And this quote from James Baldwin just nails why that happens. He wrote, "The victim who is able to articulate the situation has ceased to be a victim. He or she has become a threat." The moment the scapegoat starts to understand and actually talk about what's going on, they're no longer a victim that can be controlled. They become a threat to the whole family narrative. So for the scapegoat just starting to heal, that's seen as an act of rebellion. And you know what? This stuff is rarely new. It's often a legacy of what we call intergenerational trauma. You have parents or even grandparents with their own unresolved pain, and they unconsciously pick a child to carry that burden for them. They project their own reality onto that child, making sure those same dysfunctional patterns keep going, generation after generation. So, as you can imagine, all of this builds and builds until there's a breaking point. Eventually, the scapegoat is faced with this impossible choice, which leads to a decision that for them is truly the last resort, going no contact. And get this, if you think this is some rare thing that hardly ever happens, the numbers might just shock you. A recent study from Cornell University found that nearly a third, 1 in 3, Americans are estranged from a family member. This isn't some fringe issue. It's a silent epidemic affecting millions and millions of people. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Research shows there's this huge disconnect in why it happens. On one side, you have the adult children, and they're talking about years of emotional abuse, feeling unsupported, just toxic behavior. But then you look at the parents' side, and they're often blaming external factors, a new partner, a therapist, or maybe a messy divorce. It's like they're fundamentally unable to see their child's reality, blaming the estrangement on anything and everything except their own actions. And this quote from someone in one of those research studies, wow, it just gets to the absolute heart of it all. The decision is almost never about trying to punish the parent. It's not about revenge. It's a profound act of self-preservation. It's about finally creating enough space to stop just surviving and start the long overdue process of actually becoming a person. Okay, so what happens next? After this huge, life-altering decision is made? Well, cutting family ties isn't the end of the story. It's really the beginning of a super complex and often misunderstood healing journey. Life after going no contact is, well, it's a total paradox. Because on one hand, there's this incredible pain. You're grieving the family you wish you had, you're battling loneliness, and you're facing judgment from a world that puts family on a pedestal. But then, on the other hand, there's peace. For the first time, maybe ever, your nervous system can finally switch off that fight-or-flight mode. There's relief, there's liberation, and there's the quiet space you need to actually begin to heal. So how do you even begin to move forward from that? Well, it's about taking small, intentional steps. For once, you make your own healing the #1 priority. You could keep a journal to reconnect with your own thoughts and start reclaiming your identity. You learn to stop that hyper-vigilant habit of analyzing everyone around you. And maybe most important of all, you start building a new chosen family, a support system that's based on mutual respect and genuine care. And here's something that is just absolutely incredible. This healing, it isn't just in your head. It might actually be biological. There's this emerging field of research called epigenetics, and it suggests that trauma can literally leave marks on our DNA that can be passed down. But, and this is the amazing part, that same research shows that positive corrective experiences can actually tweak those genetic expressions. I mean, think about that. The cycle can be broken on a molecular level. And that leaves us with this final, really powerful question. We know that trauma can be passed down, right? Like a terrible inheritance. But what if one person, just one, makes that incredibly brave choice to stop the cycle, to heal themselves, to protect the next generation? Could healing become a legacy too? Could one person's absolute last resort become a brand new beginning for everyone who comes after?